Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons, Sarah Turner, Alexander Lashley and Avery. For as little as $3, you can gain access to Patreon-only episodes, as well as access to our Discord server, where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/It's Not Just In Your Head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. This week, psychotherapist Harriet Fraad and myself discuss an article sent to us by a patron entitled Hysteria, Witches and the Wandering Uterus.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
The sort of fascinating thing about this article, a diagnosis can be a weapon used as a way to control and discipline the rebellion of an entire demographic. I hadn't heard of the yellow wallpaper, and I assume you had been exposed to it before. And
I had. Florence Perkins Gilman was one of the passionate, powerful, early feminist voices, and this was a novel that she wrote, a very short novel. But it came out again, it was published again with the resurgence of women's voices in the early 70s. So I had read it before. But the principle is still there, and now it's psych meds, that when you're dissatisfied, you're not told, well, this country is falling apart, you need to join the movement. It's take a pill and be comfortably numb. It's the same idea, even if it's an alteration of that basic idea. And that it's women, 1 out of 5 women in the United States takes an antidepressant because women are more emotional, which in this article shows that emotion itself was considered an aberration. But women are more emotional, and also women have harder lives. You know, they have domestic plus job responsibilities and children and being sex objects, which is difficult. And so, you know, the principle of the yellow wallpaper, that when people rebel, you can call them crazy. That's what was done in the Soviet Union. People were put in insane asylums when they were cracking down and weren't sent to Siberia. They were often sent to insane asylums. It's a tool of control.
Yeah, so that idea of hysteria then, that was at one point a diagnosis exclusively for women. Did men get hysteria, or is it just a lady thing?
There are no reported in... I've read a lot of this stuff, and in Freud's complete works, which I read, there's no mention of male hysterics, because if it's a hungry uterus wandering around the body looking for things to gobble up, men are excluded because they don't have uterus. So It was a women's diagnosis. Men, I think, have much permission to be violent if they're upset, but women certainly didn't. And women's sexuality was much more severely repressed. Some people had clitorectomies. They cut off the clitoris if women showed too much sexual desire. They were considered aberrant.
Right, and this has its history in witches and stuff,
yes,
right?
It does. That's right. That a witch was often a midwife, someone who had power to heal, because in the early days, midwives were also wandering MDs in a sense, in that they knew the herbs that would help the sick. And so they were not only called when there was a birth, but often called when there was an illness. And so they had suspicious knowledge of the body, which itself was a despised area for the Puritans and the Catholics. So this is so wrapped up with religious prohibition.
Right. And in essence, power and who has it and who can have knowledge, that kind of stuff.
That's right. And who can be punished when they transgress the boundaries of the knowledge they're allowed to have, which is what witches were considered to do, to transgress the boundaries of allowable knowledges and be in the supernatural, but actually they were cut down because they were uppity women and had knowledge of the body. And the body was a bizarre, repressed territory in the Victorian era, of which Freud was an inhabitant. In England, there's that book, Notes of a Victorian Gentleman. Children were so often prostituted, the children of the poor, that the man in one of the prefaces describes looking for the fun child prostitute and finding his own child who had been abducted.
Wow.
And that the streets were thick with prostitutes. It was the only way that a woman could make a decent living, particularly if she had to support a child. And even now in the United States, and no doubt in Britain as well, the sex trades are the only way that women get paid more than men, and that uneducated women have a chance to earn decent money. I've had several clients, 5 in all over the many years I've been a therapist, who've come to New York City and worked as dominatrixes because it paid so much better than any other job they could get so that they could support themselves. New York is full of dungeons where people go to be abused and have sex, combine those things. And I'm sure England has the same.
Yeah, it's probably filled with bankers.
Yes, it is. It is. And one of the things that I read by a dominatrix was that she came to this man's house and he started commanding her, and she put the maid's uniform on him and started commanding him. And he got off on it because these men who oppress women all day and other men have so much guilt wrapped up with their sexuality that combining them was a winning prescription.
Yeah. So do you think then the reading of Hysteria from this point in time is that ultimately people were having a completely natural reaction to a very screwed up society and the rules that governed it?
Yes, they were. And also girls particularly who were sexually abused, since most girls were sexually abused then, even though it was denied. You know, Virginia Woolf wrote about it a little bit. It certainly participated in her suicide. But sexual abuse of girls was rampant. And there was no way to talk about it except through bodily symptoms. And so that it was also a manifestation of the opposite of the Victorian stated Puritanism, which was illicit sex with children, particularly little girls, who then grew up to be hysterical women in their description of hysterical, having symptoms.
So they've gone from one sort of, or many awful experiences, to then growing up and then being confined by this diagnosis and essentially being controlled in another way.
Absolutely.
No let up from the situation they find themselves in.
Yeah, which is what I think is relevant, particularly in this article, is the relevance of the drug culture in the United States, in which women who are upset are immediately drugged. I remember when my mother died, I got there, and because my sister was late, we just missed my mother dying, and I burst out crying. I didn't even like my mother, but I burst out crying. And they said immediately, we can give you an injection. And I thought, fuck that, I'm just crying.
Wow.
But the idea that if someone's upset, you immediately, especially if it's a woman, you immediately have to sedate her with some kind of medication is still part of our culture. And women are considered more emotional. And for most doctors who are very backward people, when other people were maturing and having experiences, they were going through medical school and internship and residency, they are particularly afraid of emotion. And women's emotion is often more powerfully expressed than they can handle. And I think of when I was a leader in a movement for midwifery rights at Yale New Haven Hospital, the head doctor was called Nathan Case. And we had a meeting and invited him to the meeting. We were he started out with all this phony research indicates and so on. And we said, we know the research. We had doctors who were parents there, and, forget that. You don't know what you're doing, and you're trying to practice on pregnant women. Shame on you, and so on. He got so hysterical, and he was trembling so much that he couldn't hold onto the doorknob to escape. And he wrote a report that said we were hysterical. Wow.
So it's the power of who gets to point the finger, who gets to use the labels.
You hit the nail on the head.
It's what's really interesting about everything you're just describing now it's happening in modern day culture and the history with hysteria is this idea around women being uniquely fragile. And I've been listening to a lot of Ashley Frowley's podcast appearances. Eventually, she did say that eventually maybe she'd come on the podcast. She wrote a kind of an interesting book about happiness, and she's working on a new one. She does various things for Sublation Media, and she was talking, and I guess I'm going to paraphrase and or butcher the point, but she was saying that this use of fragility that happens a lot in maybe our modern way of talking about mental health and therapy discourse is actually not to anyone's advantage, right? Again, I hope I'm not misrepresenting what she said, but the basic gist is this idea of like thinking of the human subject as inherently vulnerable or frail allows authorities to come in and sort of tell you what to do or boss you about. And there is and I just wonder what your thoughts are on that idea, particularly in regards to maybe contemporary therapy language or understandings, because I think it's true. I think we are a vulnerable subject, vulnerable species, but we also are incredibly resilient and strong. And I think that maybe there is something in rejecting fragility.
I think the idea is something's fragile, you need to protect it, and you could protect it out of all of its liberties and all of its possibilities. And I think women were considered fragile, partly because really we weren't allowed to be fit. That would have been aberrational in the Victorian era, women's karate classes and so on, and therefore needed the protection of a man. And it's like the protection of the fox for the hen house, that gives an enormous power to the ostensible protector. And when women rebelled against the attribution that they were weak, then they were obviously too fragile to be given any liberties. So that fragility, the way it's often used in social services and around, around women, is an excuse for the kind of protection that cuts off your wings. And that's very clear in the story of the Yellow Wallpaper, where she was acting up. She had a sense of self and therefore was considered mentally ill and locked up, denied all stimulation by her male doctors. And female doctors, I should say, I'm not a female chauvinist, are trained in the same way with the same repressive apparatus and often the same practices. So it isn't just whether you happen to have a penis or a vagina. It's a kind of attribution of emotion and passion to weakness and attribution of weakness to women. And those indigenous children that were ostensibly protected in the orphanages in Canada, where they were horribly beaten, raped, and killed, and in the United States as well. And those vulnerable, fallen women who happened to get raped by their employer or whatever in Ireland were, when they had children, those children were some of the 44,000 orphans who testified that they'd been raped and beaten and abused by the priests and nuns who were, quote, protecting them. So that whole idea of fragility requiring protection really smells, particularly when it's used in a gender-biased way, the way the yellow wallpaper illustrates it's used.
This idea of strength or resilience, like so in the yellow wallpaper story, in the actual sort of short story, she is the wife of a is he a therapist or a physician or something? And
physician.
Right. And so he basically says, okay, we're just going to go on this, we're going to go to this house or mansion or whatever you can. And he basically sort of locks her in this room, and she's supposed to have this rest cure. Right. And then ultimately she fixates on the wallpaper because there's nothing else. And she has all these sort of graphic descriptions of the wallpaper, and she feels like it's coming alive. And then she eventually feels like there's this woman behind the wallpaper, and that maybe she has to set her free. And then the husband eventually unlocks the door, and this lady thinks she is the beast that has broken free from the wallpaper, and the husband faints and all this kind of stuff. So it's really interesting, because looking at the history of it and why she wrote it is that the author went through essentially the same thing, right? This guy diagnoses the rest thing. She goes, she's not allowed to write or do anything, and she basically, nearly loses her mind, so to speak. And
can't read either.
Right,
nothing,
and
just no stimulation.
Yeah, and then she writes that as sort of personal therapy for herself, and or for she wanted to make sure other people weren't maybe going through the same thing, or use it as a critique of this thing. And to my mind, that speaks of resilience, right? Like,
totally.
She's completely endured this sort of terrible episode, and she comes out the other end wanting a better world for herself and for other people. And so I think there's something really interesting in where emphasis is put when it comes to modern day mental health related conversations. I mean, how have you, I don't have mental health qualifications. That's not my profession, but I'm interested in how you think of or have experienced this idea of how you conceptualize your clients, or how they conceptualize themselves, that is on this sort of axis of fragility versus resilience. Like, is there anything?
It's very important. I think that's a very important way of phrasing it, because I've found that when people are desperate and fragile in a sense, they need to get into their own strength and therefore get over it so that they can function again. And because I think the disempowerment is too terrible. And the disempowerment in the yellow wallpaper of the protagonist is she's locked in this room. And I know from my own personal experience that I was attacked, and being a bourgeois girl, it never occurred to me that I could fight back. And I really healed myself. In fact, I was at Columbia at the time in graduate school, and they said, how come you're back in school and doing this already? And I started taking karate and working out 3 hours a day till I knew if somebody bothered me, I could kill them. Not that I'm interested in bar fights and walking in and killing people. I'm not. But I knew that I wasn't helpless. Because the worst part is the lonely helplessness in a terrible situation. And that's so across the board. People who are tortured describe the loneliness and the invisibility of their humanity as worse than the physical pain. And then I taught free karate classes for women, which I hope helped them. And I think it did. Because thinking of oneself as helpless is terrible for one's mental health. You have to know you can function and you can take care of yourself. And then also people being politically active really helps. And I think the therapy community, it's one of the reasons we have this podcast, is terribly remiss in divorcing the mind from the society outside and the inner family influence, in addition to the society the social family and the economic family that surrounds us. And so that people recover from even terribly helpless situations when they know that they don't have to be helpless, that they can operate with power, even if it's operating with power, often it is in a movement, which I often suggest to my clients, if they're at all inclined, to join something they believe in that reverses their sense of helplessness. And that, I think, is one of the worst parts of childhood, that we don't have the words to describe what's happening to us or to analyze why it should or shouldn't happen. And so we're alone without the words, enduring things. And trauma goes away when it's shared and not endured alone. It's mitigated.
This idea of being empowered or resilient, I don't see it as some sort of stoic thing, like some of that manosphere we were talking stuff. Right. Some of the manosphere stuff we were talking about was, that men not being allowed to express emotions and stuff. It's one of the points that is made in this article is how many great ideas and possibilities arise from the very irrational place that has been and continues to be so undervalued. And I think that sort of feeds into some of the conversations we have with Bethany Morris about borderline personality disorder, just that idea of the emotional, irrational, how it is considered, even irrational, that has become sort of a loaded word. In one hand, in theory, it's trying to describe something. On the other hand, it is a sort of dismissive term.
It's very dismissive. I often think of it as the Victorian era is sort of characterized by the man with the tie and the woman with the low neck, because you have to show the man that his head is very separate from that body, and the woman's all body.
Right.
And she is the lesser for it. It's body, carnal, fragile, emotional, out of control. Candace Pert has a very good book. She's a brain scientist, called Molecules of Emotion, that shows, in terms of the analysis of the psychophysiology, that every thought is precipitated by emotion, an unknown emotion that we have, but an emotion. And that we are highly emotional creatures. But they allocated emotions to inferiority to women. And that's truly crazy for them to do that, and a way of controlling half the population.
I mean, if you wanted to be dry about it, at its most basic, emotions, as far as I understand it, are information. It's kind of amazing that emotions have been considered lesser or irrational, given that they seem to be part of a system feedback, which, the way I'm describing it all sounds very, just dry, and potentially would be very appealing to sort of the engineer mindset that, is often associated with men. You can find all kinds of male engineers sort of trying to catalog the world in particular kinds of ways.
Yes, you can, except that one of the things that they're not interested in is their own feelings about things. They're interested in the output that they're producing and want to deny any emotional component of that output. They're no doubt inspired by emotion, which initiates their thoughts. But because they are in this puritanical mindset, they don't want to acknowledge the emotion behind it. In fact, they want to condemn that emotion. They've been punished, too, for being emotional. Boys don't cry and so on.
Is it about control?
It is about control. One of the great contributions of Lacan was that he says, instead of "I think, therefore I am," which I think John Locke said, it's "I think what I think. I don't know what I am. I don't know why I think what I think." It's more like it, because the unconscious dominates and infiltrates everything. And so we've got to tip our hats to that, which they don't want to. They want to be the objective voice of reason instead of their own subjective voice, which they are.
Well, this is where it maybe perhaps gets a bit spicy, because I remember one of the conversations with Ian Parker, the co-author of Psychoanalysis and Revolution. His conceptualization of the unconscious was social, that it wasn't some unique thing buried in your brain, but your unconscious was a collective creation. And it's very interesting watching, I guess, any documentary from a different time. I've just finished watching Adam Curtis's latest documentary series about Russia and the fall of communism and democracy, really, and it transitioning to a capitalist system. And it's sort of fascinating, the little sections where you hear people speak or how they are thinking about themselves, how they see themselves relative to other things. And you realize how much the individual, including myself here, might not have any original thoughts. That you are literally the sort of patchwork of the culture that you grew up in. And so you can think they're your thoughts, but are they really? And to some degree, I also wonder, does that apply for emotions? Like, you can be having these feelings, but are they your emotions? Have they come from someone else? Does that have any validity?
I think it does, but I think it's both. I think, first of all, you have genetic components that are interacting all the time, helping to shape who you are, as well as the inner forces and the outer forces. Infants can register the emotions of the people around them. A 3-month-old baby can notice the narrowing of its caretaker's eyes and startle, because they feel the anger in their bodies, and they startle and get tense. And they keep their environment with them. Now, the first environment for little babies is their family, so they keep that with them. I was very aware of that when I walked into a room of abused children at Yale New Haven Hospital. And as they were feeding, they were hurting themselves. They were pulling their hair or digging their fingernails into their face because they associated being fed with a caretaker who abused them.
Wow.
And so we do have these unique sets of associations from our different environments interacting with our different genetic components, and the society around us influences everything. So that the idea of finding the answer is a stupid idea, because I think by the time, that's Freud's idea of overdetermination in dreams should be everywhere, as it is in overdeterminist Marxism, which is that by the time you finish defining all the influences on anything you do, you'd be dead.
Yeah.
We're all shaped by all these mutually shaping influences. And we have to decide, okay, I'm going to look at this, and then I'm going to look at that, but also have the humility to know you never have it all. That's a much more psychologically healing and humbling way of looking at it. And it prevents some of the most terrible abuses, like killing people. Because if you make that decision to kill somebody, you don't know that that's the best one to have arrived at, and then it's too late. So you don't kill people. It's against capital punishment.
The sort of fascinating thing, there's this idea of in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth thing, he talks about the Algerian colonized population, once they are colonized, they double down on their superstitions and their sort of spirituality. They were very preoccupied with keeping evil spirits away and going through particular routines to make sure that they weren't angering any of these invisible forces. And he was saying that his theory, which I buy into totally, is that that's the bit that they could control, right? They couldn't really face the real evil, which was the colonizers, because of, it's traumatizing, the amount of violence, the whole thing. So if you apply this same thing to the current, or maybe continual fascination with true crime and serial killers, that rather than address this sort of systemic murderous system
society,
we instead sort of fixate on these individuals who, like if we learn what they did, then maybe we can avoid something like that happening to us. I think it has all kinds of parallels. And the reason I bring that all up is that there's a bit in Adam Curtis's latest documentary where this sort of infamous Russian serial killer, there's a bit where he is thinking about his own why he did it, and he just said, I guess I'm just I don't know if he said I'm from hell, but clearly I'm a mistake of nature, and that I am just evil. And it's like, on one hand, of course he is. Like, he raped and killed a bunch of women and kids, right? But on the other hand, there is some part of it which is like, well, he's in a really a system that is deteriorating and that is murderous, and that ultimately oligarchs and these people are just stepping in to steal shit from lots of people. So again, he's in a so he's in a system, and he can only conceptualize of himself in that one particular way. And then it just makes me think, like, okay, hopefully none of us have done as horrendous shit as this guy's done. But the point being is, like, in what ways do we conceptualize of ourselves in really blinkered ways? And the hysteria thing and any sort of modern day equivalent is exactly that. It's asking you to think of yourself in this really limited way, opposed to seeing a bigger picture. And also in seeing that bigger picture, maybe you realize the weight of it. Can be very depressing to realize that, you are just this tiny thing in this huge machine that just consumes all the the Earth's natural resources and kills anyone who gets in the way of their profits. But also there's something empowering about it, because it's like, well, I think of myself differently in the world and my place in it. And once you know what the actual problem is, you've identified the problem accurately, then you can start doing something about it.
That's right. And also, I think each of us is a unique combination of all the influences, genetic, social in the family. And I know from the work that's done by Abby Stein and others on serial killers and mass killers. She had a very good initial article before her book was written called From His Cradle to Your Grave, that they're all describing things that they've been through. They all act out what they've been through and how they've understood it on innocent people. But there is a fascination, both personal but also social, with things like true crime series, because everybody's ripped off all the time. We're robbed. I mean, the United States sent, I think, $43 billion to the Ukraine, and arms manufacturers and oil dealers have made a fortune, and people are struggling with inflation caused by the higher gas prices that Americans want to get for their oil, which they could sell overseas. So they drive everything up. And people suspect, oh my God, I'm being ripped off. I'm endangered. We're all endangered. But there isn't a conscious political voice that's articulating that. And so you see it within this personal drama where it's containable and understandable and justice is done, which it isn't otherwise. You're living in an unjust society and you'd have to face that. And so you can see that crime in New York has gone up as evictions have gone up. People are homeless and desperate. So, desperate people do desperate things. It's obvious, and it's often denied, but it's obvious that there is certainly a strong connection. But I think we all are a unique set of experiences and genetic compounds, and we are unique connected people. You can be a unique part of a connected system, and our experiences differ. They're the same in many ways, but they're all unique also.
Yeah, one of the things that I am struggling with is this idea of I guess, corruption. Like if you're saying, desperate, if you're in a desperate situation, you start, you have to just do what you have to do, right? Like, there is I think my friend had said it best, like trickle down economics might not be true or work, but it works in terms of behavior or emotions, that you set an example, and then that trickles down, and corruption seems to be one of those things. And once things start getting desperate, then everyone can justify whatever behavior they want, because they just see the worst behaviors getting rewarded. So then everyone else feels like, oh well, I might as well do that as well.
I might as well. That's right. You can see it. I mean, Trump, I'm sure, had a big effect on the whole society with his example of constant rapes, assaults, and thievery. And Boris Johnson did the same.
Yeah, and so that trickle down behavior is kind of terrifying, because it can sort of destabilize everything. And I also wonder, does that work, sort of just linking it back to the hysteria thing, like in terms of being a professional treating these women with hysteria back in the day? It's sort of like, I'm setting the example, this is what a professional is, and then it's just some sort of, it works in the same sort of social contagion. Well, this is what you have to believe if you're a professional. You must believe that hysteria exists as a thing, and it's terrifying. Like, in what ways does that manifest today? You were saying earlier you feel like it manifests with medication.
Mm-hmm. What I see as parallel is people start to fall apart as the society's falling apart, as the American empire is falling apart. And it would be comforting for them to see that, to learn that, and to fight back in some way to preserve what they care about. But instead, they're given a pill, just like Charlotte Perkins Gilman was stuck in a room, totally disempowered. The pill can make you comfortably numb and deny you your feelings, which you need, and for which you need an outlet, rather than be numbed. And so there is some parallel there. And Freud was much less removed and acting superior to his clients than today, and certainly wasn't into medicating people the way psychiatrists are psychopharmacologists today. If you were a graduate of psychoanalysis within his group, you then could be an analyst. And you socialized together and knew one another and read each other's works and so on, so that there wasn't this utter removal of the superior physician who prescribes. It was a community in which people found a part, and that was healing in itself, and that acknowledged trauma, which in the Victorian era was not acknowledged.
I assume it must be difficult for people who, maybe women in particular, who are taking medication and they do feel better from it, because with the parallel with hysteria, it would be like, oh, of course we can all laugh at hysteria now, so we don't know what we'll be laughing at in the future. But what would be sort of your response to any women? I guess it doesn't have to be women, any people just listening to it who feel like their meds do help them.
Well, I don't know why they help. It could be the Hawthorne effect. It could be just that the idea that you're taking something that will help you certainly will help you. Certainly placebos help people. And one of the things that's reported from almost all antidepressants is at first people feel better, because at first they're convinced they're going to feel better, which really helps you feel better. So I don't know why they feel better. They may feel better being numb, but in the long run, you're better off knowing yourself and getting along with yourself than being numb. And so I think they would be better off. You do what you have to do to get by, but I think they'd be better off getting to know themselves better and appreciate who they are and get active on what they believe in. And yet, therapy is expensive. There you go.
Right. Yeah. So that's the rock and the hard place.
You bet. And going to a clinic and getting a prescription is not expensive. So it's another thing that the luxury of getting to know yourself is another thing.
Right. And I wonder with hysterics, like, it sounds to me that obviously in these particular cases, it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience. But part of reading it, I was like, wow, the recommendation is like, you just need to go to bed and just like chill out and do nothing. I was like, well, that sounds kind of slightly luxurious in some ways. Like, so I don't know if it had a class element to it that were like people who in the workhouse who got diagnosed hysterical, were they able to just like not be at work? I assume that can't have been the case.
No, and women who had to take care of children or had jobs, of course, couldn't just lie about. And it's nice to chill for a day, but not to be locked in forever, which is what it looked like for Charlotte Perkins Gilman in that room with the yellow wallpaper. And so I think it's a class-based thing to go into psychoanalysis, which they did every day. That costs a lot of money. And none of his analysans in the years that he wrote in his whole profession were really poor people. And it was a class-denying form. It was.
Right. So potentially for the lower classes or working class people, it was this way of you could, I don't know, lock them up for hysteria if you wanted to, if they were becoming problematic. Whereas presumably for the middle class, it was like, oh, we'll actually give you what we consider the cure or the treatment, which is lots of rest. Right.
Lots and
But
lots
in both instances, they're forms of control. One is perhaps slightly lighter.
And both of them deny that some of this comes from disempowerment. And when people can feel more powerful in their lives and have some say over their lives, the opposite of being locked up, of course, they can heal themselves. And one of the things that happened in that huge experiment of Anton S. Makarenko, who was the minister of education in the early Russia, when Russia became a communist country in its most early and honest years. They had the problem of orphans because thousands of children were orphaned. Their parents were killed or dumped them on the street, and they became predatory gangs that stole and were a menace to society. And so this Makarenko, who became the education minister, had an idea of setting up children's colonies. So they would, once they got established, they would send the children to these colonies where they did everything themselves. It was all empowerment. They made their own uniforms, they grew their own food, they maintained the place themselves, and they had councils deciding things. And when one of the orphans was caught, usually for committing petty crimes, and arrived at the train station, they met them with their brass band, burned their old clothes, gave them the uniform, and introduced them to this society of empowerment for these children. And all but two in their hundreds and hundreds of people that they processed, from about 6 years old to teenagers of 18, got better because they were surrounded by a system they could understand, and they were empowered. The older kids had different responsibilities from the younger kids, but everyone participated, and they were governed by student councils. I mean, they couldn't give harsh punishments because the adults had something to say, but it was empowerment and nobility that healed them. And I think those things are utterly neglected in something like the Yellow Wallpaper and in a lot of therapeutic discourse.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.